High in the crystalline observation tiers of the Cillian Council, Junior Archivist Vale kept his data stylus moving. The metal tip kept catching on a microscopic scratch near the edge of his screen. He pressed harder, forcing the ink to digitize, determined not to miss a single syllable. Below him, Empress Kelia Vance stood before the assembly. Her silver armor caught the harsh overhead light as she reaffirmed her 20-cycle vow. Absolute isolation. No mate, no bond, no personal attachments to compromise or rule. Vale documented the exact amplitude of her voice. The vow was the foundational law of the hegemony. It was immutable. Then the humans walked in. Soft. That was Vale's first official physiological classification of the species. When Commander Elias Thorne, their defensive liaison, stepped onto the polished floor, Vale noted the absence of dermal plating. Yet, the human did not avert his eyes when the Empress focused her bright, slit-pupiled gaze upon him. Thorne simply met the look. Vale categorized the human's posture as standard military readiness, though the total lack of tension in his shoulders suggested. Actually, Vale had no existing metric for a creature that looked both entirely relaxed and completely lethal. The anomaly persisted into the night. Assigned to catalog the nocturnal biorhythms of the Lumina terraces, Vale was adjusting his optical filters when he heard footsteps. He slipped behind a massive, glowing trunk. Commander Thorne stood in the restricted gardens, wearing simple fabric, watching the blue light pulse from the leaves. Empress Kelia appeared moments later. Protocol dictated she summon the guard. Instead, Vale watched in mounting confusion as the Empress allowed the human to close the physical distance between them. Thorne spoke quietly, questioning the necessity of her vow. Vale couldn't hear every word over the hum of the flora, but he recorded the visual data. The Empress did not step away. Her jaw loosened. The rigid perfection of her posture softened by a fraction of a degree. By the next afternoon, Vale was questioning his own sensor calibrations. He sat in the upper stands of the Citadel's combat ring, tasked with recording Earth's combat methodology. High Prelate Morven had ordered a demonstration. The Cillian warriors were massive, bred for crushing impacts. Commander Thorne stepped onto the mat with a quiet economy of motion. When a seasoned warrior lunged with a bone-shattering downward strike, Thorne did not block. He stepped inside the arc, caught the warrior's forearm guard, pivoted, and used the Cillian's own massive momentum to send him crashing onto the metal deck. Silence swallowed the arena. We thought the humans were fragile, but if you want to know what happens when that fragility turns into a weapon, stick around. Before Vale could finalize his report on the match, the primary sirens triggered. A violent red strobe washed out the arena lights. Interference in the Cobalt sector. A guard captain shouted from the lower deck, his voice barely cutting through the klaxons. Internal grid is jammed. Vale leaned over the railing. He watched the Empress abandon her viewing seat, her ion saber already unclipped from her hip. He expected her guards to form a standard wedge. He did not expect Commander Thorne to instantly flank her, matching her stride perfectly. Driven by a sudden, terrifying academic curiosity, Vale scrambled down the access stairwell, trailing far behind them. The corridors of the Cobalt sector were swallowed by emergency lighting. Shadows stretched long and sharp. Ahead of him, the Empress and the humans stopped at a junction. Three figures emerged from the gloom, their armor matte black, bearing the faded insignia of the Kalen faction. Assassins. Vale pressed his back against the cold wall, his stylus frozen over the scratched screen, waiting for the slaughter. Vale dragged his boots over scorched plating and shattered conduit casings, his breath catching in his throat as the metallic stench of ruptured circuitry mixed with the distinct, terrifying ozone tang of a fully ignited ion saber cutting through standard-issue faction armor. He crept downward through the dim emergency lighting, tracking the Empress and the human deeper into the Citadel's core. They reached the primary threshold of the plasma matrix. 6 insurgents were hurriedly wiring high-yield explosive charges to the heavy external seals of the core housing. The combat that followed defied every principle of Cillian tactical doctrine Vale had ever recorded. Kelia moved with relentless, lethal grace, her blade a violet blur against the dark metal. Commander Thorn fought beside her, actively intercepting strikes meant for her blind spots. He fought with empty hands, using leveraged momentum to break joints, prioritizing her defense over his own survival at every turn. Then, a lone insurgent broke through the defensive line. The saboteur sprinted toward the housing and slammed his hand onto the final detonator sequence. Vale calculated the blast radius in his head. If the matrix destabilizes, the atmospheric regulators will. Light swallowed the corridor. Vale was thrown backward against the cold bulkhead by the sheer force of the shockwave. His audio receptors rang with painful static. When the dense smoke finally cleared enough for his optical sensors to adjust, he witnessed an absolute impossibility. The human had not run for cover. Commander Thorn lay in the center of the blackened blast crater, his uniform shredded and scorched. He had thrown his own body entirely over the explosive charge to absorb the lethal fragmentation. The Empress dropped to her knees in the smoldering wreckage, ignoring her own minor burns. Vale zoomed his recording lens, capturing the exact moment Kelia reached out. Her trembling fingers touched the human's soot-stained cheek. It was an act of profound, forbidden intimacy. A sovereign bleeding her emotions into the open air for a fragile outsider. A red low battery light blinked steadily on the side of Vale's data stylus, an absurdly trivial warning against the backdrop of a shattered worldview. Hours later, the Citadel's internal sensors and primary lights were fully restored. Vale sat in his designated pod high above the Grand Council chamber, meticulously indexing the morning's chaos. Below him, the surviving nobles demanded blood, vengeance, and reassurance. They expected the Empress to brutally reinforce her authority and tradition. Instead, Empress Kelia stood, silencing the room, and did the unthinkable. She formally abolished the 20-cycle vow of isolation. She stated clearly, her voice echoing off the marble, that true power came from trusting those willing to bleed for you, not from a lonely throne. The council erupted into a chaotic storm of shouting voices and slammed fists. Vale simply saved his document, logged the exact timestamp of the decree, and classified it under a newly created category for systemic cultural shifts. His final assignment for the cycle was to monitor the external security feeds. He calibrated a long-range optical drone over the Lumina terraces. On a high observation balcony, the Empress stood with Commander Thorn. The human was heavily bandaged, leaning his weight against the railing, yet he stood remarkably straight when she approached. Vale could not hear their words through the thick glass of the dome. He did not need to. Through the grainy optical feed, Vale watched the Empress of the Cillian hegemony lift her hand. Her fingers rested against the human's jaw, tracing the edge of a fresh scar. It was no longer the desperate touch of a survivor in the wreckage, but the deliberate, permanent anchor of a new empire.